Hello. Disclaimer at the top. I'm sick, and I have a wisdom tooth coming in, and next week is finals week, and I wrote, this is probably like the longest script I've written for this channel so far. So yeah, if I look a little frail, that's probably why. When we attempt to analyze stories, we're often looking for some kind of underlying statement within them. Stories themselves often act as a sort of vehicle for these core sentiments. I don't at all mean to say that the stories themselves are superfluous fluff. Quite the opposite. The stories that carry these messages offer them much needed texture, context, and weight. For instance, I could tell you that unbridled technological progress might come with unforeseen and unwanted side effects, which themselves could result in mind-bending, identity-shattering, and brand-new moral issues. I could go on to tell you that this is especially true when that progress is being facilitated by corporations whose interests, importantly, begin and end at their own profitability. And you could agree with me on all of that. But instead, what if I just showed you Blade Runner? Those are, at least to me, the main themes of Blade Runner. But, of course, just hearing me state the film's message doesn't give you the full picture of what it is and what it's saying. I would argue, in the case of Blade Runner at least, you feel its message before you even fully understand it. You feel it in the ever-present rain beating down on the neon city. You feel it in the dry, amber hues of the android slave colony. You can sense it in high-tech advertisements which sprawl across entire skyscrapers and which are set against a city which we know is teeming with crime and poverty. We call these sentiments by many names. A theme, a message, a thesis, a moral. All of these terms mean fairly similar things. For the purposes of this video, the one we pick isn't that important, and I will be using them fairly interchangeably. But I do want to briefly highlight one that I find rather interesting. The last one. A moral. Moral feels a bit more definitive than those other terms I mentioned. Typically, what we mean when we refer to a moral in regard to a story is the prescriptive moral claim or claims that that story can be broken down to. The most obvious example of this is seen in fables. Think of The Boy Who Cried Wolf. A boy repeatedly and dishonestly cries wolf. He does this so much that people stop taking his pleas for help seriously. Then, one night, a real wolf shows up, and the boy cries out for help. Unfortunately, these cries are disregarded, and the boy is eaten by the wolf. The moral of this story is, of course, do not be dishonest, as people do not trust a person known for their dishonesty. In this way, The Boy Who Cried Wolf is making a prescriptive moral claim. It is conveying a message about morality, about the way we should be and the things we should and should not do. Most stories have these to some degree or other. I gave the Blade Runner example earlier, although in that example, it might admittedly be more apt to call it a theme. These are somewhat slippery terms. But the fact remains that, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Blade Runner makes a statement about the way things are, or the way they could soon be, and through that appraisal, implies a sentiment about the way things should be. It is saying something about the world, and about the morality of some part of it. And, like I said, most stories in general have this. But what if they didn't? If you would, imagine a story without a moral. Or maybe it would be better to put it like this. Imagine a story in which the moral challenges the very idea of morals in stories, as well as morals in real life. A story which doubts the very idea that we as humans are fit to make large, sweeping claims about morality. What would that story be like? We might at times call certain art moral or immoral, depending on whether or not we find its prescriptive claims to be good or bad. But what happens when a piece of art is about the absence of these categories altogether? In other words, what would amoral art look like? No Country for Old Men is, to me, that kind of movie. It's a violent, brooding mess of questions about our conceptions of morality. It is a film which attempts to shake the very foundation of our ideas of right and wrong. And furthermore, by its end, the film seems to question whether or not we should be so arrogant as to make such concrete claims about right and wrong in the first place. Before I get too much farther into exploring the film, I do want to point out one important characteristic of it. And that is that this film is like a Rorschach test. Something about the film, about its story, lends itself to extensive interpretation. You can find a myriad of reviews and think pieces on the internet that read the film as everything from a cynical critique of capitalism to a bleak deconstruction of masculinity. And those reads are very well grounded. I want to highlight this fact about the film as a sort of disclaimer. The following will be my approach to reading a film that is uniquely unapproachable. And in line with the subjective philosophy of the film, I'd like to say that there is nothing that makes my read more correct than anyone else's. That being said, I do think that when this video is all said and done, you'll agree that my takes on this film are pretty uncontroversial, and are also pretty easily able to coexist with other interpretations out there of the film. I would argue that the sense of amorality that I'm going to be exploring in this video is the most central element of the film, and at the very least, is nearly impossible to miss when watching it. Remember how I said that the themes of Blade Runner are primarily felt before they are understood? In the same way, I would argue that No Country for Old Men's absence of morality is equally palpable. If I were a betting man, I would wager that that feeling, the feeling of No Country's ethical void, is the primary thing people walk away from the film with, whether they're immediately able to articulate it or not. I want to explore this further, but in case you've never seen the film, or in case it's been a little while, let me first give you a basic summary of the plot. This guy, Llewelyn Moss, is hunting out in the desert somewhere in West Texas. At one point, he happens upon the grisly remnants of a drug deal gone wrong. A circle of pickup trucks. The dead bodies of men and dogs are strewn about in the dust between them. Llewelyn investigates the scene to find a case of money and only one survivor. A man still strapped into the passenger seat of one of the trucks. Llewelyn leaves the man to die and takes off with the money. From here, he heads home. But before long, he starts feeling guilty about abandoning the dying man. Against his better judgment, he fills up a jug with water and heads back out into the desert. He finds the man already dead, but before he can leave, a group of men coming to recover the money show up and spot him. He's able to narrowly escape with his life, but has to abandon his truck, thus revealing his identity to the assailants. At this point, the film becomes a tense game of cat and mouse, especially when hired killer Anton Chigurh enters the fray. Chigurh is the cold-blooded, iconic hitman hired by the faceless corporate owner of the cash Llewelyn just took off with. Chigurh goes rogue almost immediately, killing 2 other representatives of the company, but continues pursuing Llewelyn for his own gain. The pursuit is a bloody one. We see Chigurh callously murder a series of people who happen to stumble into his path. In many of these instances, the murder weapon is an air gun, which is commonly used for slaughtering cattle. We see the aftermath of this long, gruesome crime spree through the eyes of Sheriff Bell, an old-fashioned yet increasingly disillusioned lawman. He's hot on the heels of Chigurh and Llewelyn through most of the film, but always seems to show up ever so slightly too late. We see Bell experience disappointment after disappointment, finding only corpses, burned out cars, and glasses of milk still sweating in the desert heat. Finally, in the end, it is not Chigurh, but the cartel on the other side of the botched drug transaction that catches up with Llewelyn. He is found in his hotel room and killed. Importantly, Llewelyn's death takes place off-screen. We happen upon this gruesome scene solely through the eyes of Sheriff Bell, who is, again, too late to do anything or to help anyone. At this point, the film kind of just fizzles out. We see Chigurh get into a car crash. He is T-boned by another driver who runs a red light. He stumbles out of the car, fashions a sling for his arm out of a t-shirt, and then limps away. We also see Sheriff Bell succumb to a deep moral disillusionment. His story ends with him accepting that he is an old-timer, and that the senselessness of this modern crime is something he can't wrap his head around. He simply hangs up his hat and retires. So, I think even in this simplified description of the film, you can already get a sense for that amorality that I want to explore. This is a story without heroes. The one character we might be tempted to see as a moral authority, Sheriff Bell, is repeatedly shown to us to be confused, outmoded, and impotent. The character we might see as the villain, Chigurh, wins, more or less. At the very least, he's not punished in the way we expect to see villains punished. Yes, his story ends in a car crash, but he walks away from it. It feels far more like random happenstance than any kind of fitting moral resolution to Chigurh's arc. The final main character, Llewelyn, doesn't feel like a main character at all. The story doesn't develop him much. He doesn't have an internal journey in the film. He's just kind of a dude who's acting out of self-interest. The individual ways each of these characters' stories play out in No Country for Old Men are very important here, as each of their paths differ in subtle but important ways. So let's go ahead and break down these individual characters a bit further. First, let's start with our de facto protagonist, Llewelyn Moss. Moss is, to me, a representation of a generic kind of moral disillusionment. He at no point seems to consider the ethics of taking the money. When he finds it, his mentality seems to be mostly pragmatic. He looks over the scene, ensures that there are no viable witnesses to his crime, and takes the money. When he finds a dying man in the passenger seat of one of the trucks, he doesn't initially help him. But he also doesn't harm him, despite the fact that he is a witness. He even attempts to bring the man water, which he pays for dearly. After all, if not for this act of goodwill, the cartel, the corporation, and Anton Chigurh all would likely not have known of his involvement. All of this, to me, reflects a man who does not firmly subscribe to a set of moral principles, but is, importantly, also not completely devoid of a sense of right and wrong. Sure, he may not be a good man, whatever that means, but he's certainly not a man unrestrained by moral instinct. He is calculated, calm in his taking of the money, and yet he is still burdened by the weight of a dying man on his conscience. I think it's important here to note that Llewelyn, as well as Anton Chigurh, are both veterans of the Vietnam War. A war that, and this is pretty uncontroversial to say, was a failure for the United States. It was also a conflict that was mired in controversy on the home front. America's involvement in it was characterized as altruistic by its government, a benevolent protection of democracy, a decidedly heroic effort against evil totalitarian communism in the region. But the end of the war saw scores of veterans and countercultural groups feeling that they'd been lied to with these grandiose claims of goodwill. They were scarred, physically and mentally, and they received no satisfying answer as to why they were sent to fight in the first place. This context is very illuminating to the character of Llewelyn Moss. There's a kind of hesitancy in his character toward this kind of clean, heroic view of morality. He is concerned with self-preservation first and foremost, and clearly understands that being altruistic, in the way that governments mythologize during wartime, is not all it's cracked up to be. In a word, Llewelyn Moss is cynical. In this way, he reads as a protagonist who is determined not to be one. When he finds the carnage in the desert, he doesn't see an opportunity to be a hero. He doesn't see an injustice to be rectified. He doesn't resolve himself to solve the mystery or to track down the ne'er-do-wells responsible. No. Llewelyn Moss surveys the destruction, acts in his own rational self-interest by taking the money, and then leaves, hoping to have no further involvement in the situation. This cynicism is ultimately reinforced when his one attempt at goodwill, bringing water to a dying man, is immediately rendered pointless and eventually costs him his life. No Country for Old Men does this kind of thing a lot. And I would argue it's one of the main ways the film draws our attention to the moral dimension of its story. It takes a character like Moss and puts them into a familiar role. In Moss's case, the role of a protagonist. These roles come along with expectations. Protagonists generally do good things, generally experience some kind of character development. Moss has the make of a protagonist, and so it is quite striking to us in the audience when we see him act so unheroically. He is no hero, but he doesn't really fit comfortably into any other common archetype. He's a complex person, and complex people, the movie seems to suggest, are not so easily morally categorized. We'll talk more about Llewelyn in a bit, but first, I want to touch on the other two main characters. First, let's explore the character of Anton Chigurh. Chigurh is a hitman, hired by one of the parties involved in the botched drug deal, specifically for the purpose of recovering the money Llewelyn stole. Almost immediately, though, Chigurh is revealed to be quite a bit more than that. He betrays his employers, and yet continues pursuing Moss with a passionless determination that is absolutely bone-chilling. He is determined to kill Moss and take the money for himself. And yet it feels like the money is only part of his motivation. It would feel like a disservice to simply call Anton Chigurh a gun for hire. It would seem more appropriate to call him a killer. a master of violence, a master of his own fate, a master of dispensing those that come between him and his goals. He is, at his most base form, an agent of chaos, unrestrained by ethical considerations, and therefore able to enact his will on the world around him freely and decisively. And to me, it seems that, in addition to the monetary incentive, Chigurh is also engaging in this game of cat and mouse simply for the sake of expressing that sort of existential freedom from petty morality. We might, by this assessment, be led to believe that the film is endorsing Chigurh, but I don't think that that's the intention of the character at all. As I said before, the film really isn't in the business of making statements about right and wrong. In the case of Chigurh, the film doesn't want you to walk away believing that he's correct, but it does want you to walk away knowing that he is powerful and effective, horrifically so. Chigurh, as a character, is reminiscent of the concept of the Übermensch. The Übermensch is a concept created by Friedrich Nietzsche, and exists as sort of an ideal of what we as free individuals should strive toward. To Nietzsche, and I would argue to Chigurh as well, God is dead, and morality is dead with him. And in their absence, we are left with a raw and utter freedom. It is up to us to exact our will on the world around us. The mark of a good man to Nietzsche is not his capacity for altruism, nor his adherence to some moral code or other, but rather the freedom and strength with which he exerts his will on the world around him, and on his own destiny. Now, it's important to note after saying all of this that, yes, Nietzsche was an asshole. But at the same time, he probably wasn't envisioning someone like Anton Chigurh when he was formulating his ideal of ultimate freedom. The film's portrayal of Anton Chigurh seems to take the Übermensch concept to one possible logical conclusion of it, one that quite resembles a common critique of Nietzsche's work. This key criticism essentially states that the Übermensch model tacitly endorses brutality. This position is granted some extra legitimacy due to some other peripheral beliefs held by Nietzsche. Namely that, when discussing the modern world, he often paints a picture of a society which is deeply spiritually sick. The Übermensch is meant to exist in contrast to this sick world, to transcend it, to master it. Even the term Übermensch, meaning overman, conveys this image of a transcendent, perfect person, taking charge and mastering the world around him. Nietzsche importantly argues that common concepts of morality are part of this spiritual sickness, and must be moved beyond in order to reach the point of the Übermensch. And maybe you see the potential issue here. This philosophy could be interpreted as an endorsement of taking charge over one's existence, being productive, creative, free to form your own moral system. But it could also easily be interpreted as condoning the coercion, manipulation, and extortion of lower people at the hands of the strong, transcendent overmen. When spun the wrong way, Nietzsche's philosophy can sound a bit fascistic, and that's in no small part because his work was co-opted by the most notorious fascists in history, the Nazis. Now, to be fair, there's a good case to be made that Nietzsche is often misunderstood. There's also a good case that his sister, who was in charge of his estate following his death, intentionally manipulated his work to better fit into Nazi ideology, as she was herself a Nazi. Suffice it to say, Nietzsche was kind of vague at times, and the line between transcending petty morality and discarding morality outright is a pretty blurry one. All of this to say, I think Anton Chigurh encapsulates this idea that a man, unchained from morality, can be a powerful thing, but quite possibly also a dangerous one. Again, that difference between transcendence and abandoning, between exercising the freedom to establish one's own values and the rabid dissolving of all sense of values, is quite a hard thing to parse. Anton Chigurh seems to me representative of this void, a symbol of this dangerous estrangement from morality. If Llewelyn Moss shows us a man whose belief in morality has been shaken, Anton Chigurh embraces this disbelief. He takes the apparent non-existence of morality to its logical conclusion, and conducts himself accordingly. He seems to extrapolate this non-belief even further still. If there is no God, if there's no grand moral rule, no justice, then the only arbiter left is the sheer chaos of the universe. If Chigurh worships anything in the film, it is chance. It is the roll of the dice, the wager we all make when we leave the house that we will return in one piece. We see this reverence for chance in the character's strange penchant for coin flips. At several points in the film, we see Chigurh offer coin flips as a means of deciding whether a given person will be killed or spared. These scenes are pretty iconic at this point. In possibly the most notable one, he is menacing a gas station attendant. After a series of vague threats against the man, he flips a coin and demands the man call heads or tails. Prior to this moment, Anton had inquired into the man's life. The man had, in response, painted a picture of a quiet, safe existence. The gas station had been in his wife's family. Chigurh scoffs at this fact, implying that the man just married into it, demeaning his slow, safe life choices. When faced with the demand to call the coin toss, the man hesitantly replies, "But I'm not putting anything up." Chillingly, Anton declares that the man has been putting it up his entire life, that this coin has been traveling 22 years to get here, and now it's here, and it's either heads or tails, and you have to say. Chigurh sees the gas station attendant as a man who is too weak to embrace chance, to embrace the chaos of life, and to exert his own will on his destiny. He sees a man who has lived a safe, measured life, who has married into a comfortable sum of money, and who is, in effect, eschewing his own freedom to engage with his fate. He sees a coward. In response, Chigurh demands the attendant to confront his fate, to make a free and real decision, heads or tails. Okay, I just talked about Anton Chigurh for a very long time, but I think that's okay. He deserves a lengthy explanation, as he's a very layered and thought-out character. I also think he's a character who gets misinterpreted really often. Some people like to characterize him as an anti-hero, and I don't know. I think that honestly does No Country for Old Men a huge disservice, and is also just kind of generally a psychotic take to have. I mean, if I see one more red pill, lone wolf-ass TikTok that says some shit about masculinity and not tolerating fake friends, set to footage of the Anton Chigurh murdering people, I'm gonna blow a gasket. Now I want to talk about our final main character, Sheriff Bell. Bell is, to me, a representation of traditional approaches to morality. To connect back a bit, I would argue that he is a representation of that kind of black and white, generationally handed down approach to morality that Nietzsche wants to transcend. He is not only a rule follower, but also a rule enforcer. It's also important to point out that he's a character who plays heavily upon the tropes of the Western genre. Bell reads to the audience as a classic John Wayne lawbringer type, a no-nonsense beacon of right and wrong in a lawless place. In a traditional Western, we would expect Sheriff Bell to be the strong bringer of order, who would ultimately bring an end to the crime we see throughout the film. No Country for Old Men is not a traditional Western, though, and we learn that very quickly. Bell, unlike the Old West lawmen he is modeled after, is not equipped to bring order to the kind of godless depravity he's up against. To the contrary, Bell is constantly portrayed as old, impotent, and slow. He is always late to the scene of the crime. He is always thwarted by this new, seemingly senseless evil. That new-old dynamic is really the core of Bell's arc in the film. He constantly talks about old times and old-timers. He clearly sees these bygone eras as more simple, more understandable. These were the times of the John Wayne lawmen, a time of easily identifiable good guys and bad guys. A time where even the bad guys adhered to some kind of predictable code of honor. And now that that time has apparently passed, Sheriff Bell finds himself lost in the darkness of a moral void. The depravity of Anton Chigurh is not predictable. He adheres to no code which Sheriff Bell could ever hope to understand. This inadequacy on Bell's part is finally punctuated in the final moments of the film. He just quits. His story does not end with a grand triumphing over evil. He doesn't bring law to lawlessness. He, like his worldview, is tired and old, and incompatible with the current state of things. The lawmen in John Wayne movies are ultimately reaffirmed in their approaches to the world around them. They are up against men who typically are misguided in their understandings of the moral world. Men who have moral codes. Incorrect moral codes, sure, but moral codes all the same. And yes, these traditional lawmen might face challenges along the way, and yes, they are occasionally, temporarily thwarted by the bad guys, but only for a time. By the time the credits roll, they prevail. They reaffirm to themselves, and to the audience, that we live in a world of order. That order might be challenged from time to time, but those challenges will always be quelled. The good will always prevail because the moral dimension of life is ultimately composed of understandable good and bad, right and wrong. And when we can easily identify the wrong, we can easily address and rectify it. That is the world that Bell once believed he lived in. But now, in light of the events of the film, this preconception is fundamentally and seemingly permanently shaken. The things Sheriff Bell encounters in No Country for Old Men are not easily reconcilable with his worldview. The crimes he encounters are not the result of men with broken moral compasses. They are the result of men who reject the very need for a moral compass in the first place. And faced with this, Bell walks away, tired, beaten, and lost. So by the end of the film, we've been posed a lot of big existential questions. Questions like, what is our role in this world? Where do our moral obligations lie within it? Does moral obligation exist in the first place? And if not, what are the implications of that non-existence? And the film answers none of these questions. Earlier, I described the film's ending as a fizzling out. By that, I do not mean that the film cops out by any means. More that it seems to consciously reject the need for a firm resolution. To explain what I mean, let's look again at the respective endings of our main characters' stories. Llewelyn is found and killed off-screen by the cartel. The actions he takes that leave him vulnerable to this are the two most obviously benevolent actions he takes in the film. I already covered his earlier attempt to bring water to a dying man, but I've, until now, not mentioned the decision that ultimately seals his fate. See, when Llewelyn got the money, he sent his wife, Carla Jean, to go stay with her mother, in an attempt to keep her safe. Later in the film, money in hand, he plans to meet with them at a motel to hand off the money and get them to safety. Shortly after the rendezvous point is decided upon, Llewelyn's mother-in-law accidentally reveals it to a group of cartel members who'd been tailing them. This ultimately leads to the death of Llewelyn Moss. I do want to note, I don't think the film is making some edgy claim about how you should trust no one here, or that caring about others will ultimately be your downfall. I think it's telling us, however, that these kinds of entanglements can make someone vulnerable. Above all else, I think the film is ultimately just showing us a man who rolled the dice, took a chance, and lost. He, in some way, did play the game. He did accept the chaos and the inherent lawlessness of the universe, and he did attempt to seize his destiny. But he ultimately came up short. Sure, those remnants of traditional morality that exist within him might have contributed to his downfall, but again, I don't think we're to take that as some kind of indictment of him as a character, nor as an endorsement of a more extreme disregarding of morality. And what of that extreme disregard for morality? I'd argue that Anton Chigurh's character and his approach to morality do not go unchallenged in the film. Before he gets into the car wreck, he pays a visit to Llewelyn's wife, and offers her the opportunity to engage in his trademark bet. When faced with the option of a coin flip for her life, Carla Jean rejects his framing outright. She tells him, "The coin don't have no say. It's only you." Here, Carla Jean is rightly pointing out a contradiction in Chigurh's logic. Throughout the film, we see him as a man devoted to the seizing of one's own destiny, the application of one's own will to their fate. And yet, he also possesses a certain reverence for the inherent chaos of existence. In these moments, he is exacting his will on the world. To put it simply, he is making decisions. So his appeals to chance are thus rendered somewhat illogical. Chigurh idolizes strength, will, and decisiveness, and yet also defers to the randomness of chance to explain his own horrific decisions. Finally, let's talk about Sheriff Bell. I won't reiterate in too much depth the way his story ends, but I do want to touch on the implications of it, as I believe they are the closest thing we get to a definitive statement from this film. I think that more than with any other character, the film is most directly critical of Bell's approach to morality. I think this is evidenced heavily in his incompetence. At risk of stating the obvious here, the film is titled No Country for Old Men. It's as if the film as a whole is saying, yes, Chigurh and Moss's respective approaches to the absence of objective morality are seriously questionable. But Sheriff Bell is something else altogether. Sheriff Bell has yet to even accept the death of objective moral truth. Because of this, he is rendered a thing of the past, out of touch and irrelevant. A tired, lost, old man. And yeah, I think that's where I'm going to end this one. No Country for Old Men is a film that interrogates the concept of moral truth, and yet also critiques its alternatives. It is decidedly not a film about answering questions, only posing them. I'd go as far as to argue that it's not a film that believes it's even possible to answer these questions. No Country for Old Men is not trying to offer us any kind of guidance in the moral darkness. It's simply trying to show us just how lost we really are.